Hi everybody, it's Lauren Dockett with Psychotherapy Networker, and you are joining us on Facebook Live at Symposium 2019. It is Saturday afternoon, and I am thrilled to have with me Suzanne Iasenza. Suzanne, thanks for taking the time.
Happy to.
Suzanne is a sex therapist and a psychotherapist who works up in Manhattan, and she teaches at the Ackerman Institute and the Institute for Contemporary Psychotherapy and Psychoanalysis, also in New York City. And she has a book coming out from Routledge called Transforming Sexual Narratives, which will add to her other two books she's already got under her belt. And she has been doing some really innovative, interesting stuff in the field. So there are sex therapists out there, there are psychotherapists out there, there are psychotherapists who want to do a little bit more in the area of sex therapy. They're still not sure quite what they're doing. So I always love to have these conversations with people who do both so they can really educate our audience. You have a 3-part process of working with couples that helps them free themselves from rigid ideas of what sex should be so they can explore what really brings them pleasure. So let's take a little bit of time and you take us through that process.
Okay, basically, I think of it as a narrative frame in general. The overall umbrella is a narrative frame, meaning whatever beliefs we have are stories we tell ourselves. So part of what I'm interested in is where do those stories come from? And most people, when they come in with a sexual problem, don't even know that stories are fueling with their shutdowns or their anxieties or aversions or whatever is going on. So a large part of my work is helping people identify the narratives and even to start to transform them or challenge them. And there are many different sources of these narratives. So probably because I'm trained in psychoanalytic work as well as couples therapy and sex therapy, a little bit of a mutt in that way, I take those forms of thinking and bring them to the patients to be curious about what sources bring these narratives to life for them, usually in not a good way. So one big one, let's say, can be your family of origin, right? So I spend a fair amount of time doing in-depth sexual histories with patients. So with a couple, for instance, I do those separately, not together.
Okay.
So people really have the privacy and the freedom to just unfold their sexual story with me without necessarily consciously or unconsciously censoring themselves because their partner's there. And so I start these histories with what's your very earliest memory of sexuality, as far back as people can remember. And then unfold it through childhood, adolescence, first couple experiences perhaps, all the relationships they've had prior to this present relationship, and then how they unfold their story of how sexuality occurred in this present relationship. So by the time we're finished with it, could be 3, 4, 5 individual sessions for each partner, which is a lot of time, that people then, we come back after all that time and start to be very curious about how each person's sets of sexual narratives are actually being kind of working together to co-create the sexual problem or to co-maintain it. And then what parts of those narratives need to be transformed and what new kinds of narratives need to be created for people, almost to like Michael White might say, the family therapist, narrative family therapist, to re-author a sexual life, both individually and together. So it's a slower process than general sex therapy might be, which may focus more behaviorally on the issues. But I often find with the more complex problems people come in with now, the number one problem people come in with now are desire issues. They either, it could be the discrepant desire couple where one wants more sex than the other. It could be the low desire or no sex couple where both say we haven't had sex in years. And that's often the most common presenting problem in sex therapy. And those kinds of issues usually are multi-layered, could have actually unconscious as well as conscious sources of problems. So.
And this has got to be novel for them. They've probably never looked back beyond their first sexual experiences as adults or teens, right? To really go.
Even the whole idea of a sexual history for most people, like, really?
What's
a
that?
Sexual history?
Yeah,
if they've been to therapy before, they had a regular history, right? You know, telling your mom, your dad, whatever. And this really starts with what's your first memory of sexuality, which is an interesting starting point to then start to weave, and kind of unpack how they develop to who they are now.
Fascinating.
Right?
So then you say you also have this goal, and one of your goals is to help couples ultimately be a strong, erotic team. So once they've gone through this process with you,
Mm-hmm.
how do you know when they've made it to the point that they're a strong erotic team? Yeah.
All right, well, probably one of the first things I think is instead of doing sex, they are being when they're sexual. So it is a bit of a kind of Buddhist or meditative idea, but that really is what helps people be most alive, is when they're in the present moment. Whether we're in life or we're in sex, you know, being in the present moment is where aliveness happens, where spontaneity can happen, where creativity can happen. So if people are kind of being in sex rather than doing sex, moving away from the performance-oriented models we have, like, you know, you have to have desire, arousal, and then orgasm, and they move from that type of model to some of the later sexual models that are out there that probably most people don't know about, but that begin or end with other things, like willingness, beginning with willingness, ending with pleasure, or beginning with willingness and ending with connection. Those are other models for sexual health that hardly anyone knows about, including therapists, by the way. And those are other sources of narratives that hopefully get changed in the process of the work, so that a couple who's ready to graduate, so to speak, from sex therapy would be in the being of sex more than the doing. Less performance oriented.
Both on board together.
Both on board together.
Right.
Both moving from judgment of self or other to more curiosity. So no matter what's emerging, you're more curious about it than judgmental. And finally, I make sometimes a joke with patients. You know what? You'll be ready to graduate when you can do good bad sex, and they'll laugh about that. And I'll say, what I mean by good bad sex is no matter what happens that you might have thought was bad, or might feel uncomfortable or whatever, that you have plan B and C, and that you always leave connected. That it doesn't matter what happens when you're sexual tonight. That if you can leave connected and feeling good about yourself and each other, that's what good sex is. And then people have those skills to really move through and kind of surfboard through a sexual experience. So no matter what happens, the body doesn't act the way it should, or you think it should, right? Or the arousal doesn't happen, or the whatever doesn't happen that they think should, that they can stay together and have fun and just let it be.
Fantastic.
That's what I think I would say is a good erotic team.
It's a revelatory way of thinking about it. Thanks so much, Suzanne.
You're welcome.
Thanks, everybody. That's it for Facebook Live. Take care.